My name is Ralph Krauss. I'm the Manual's sommelier, downtown Orlando. And today we want to talk a little bit about how to choose a wine. So say, for example, you're in a dining room in a restaurant and you've got a group of people and you want to choose a wine for that group of people. Obviously, you're going to ask the people what type of wine they want. Some people are only going to drink white wine. Some people are only going to drink red wine. Some people like fruity wines. Some people like dry wines. Here's a couple of hints and some things to get you going. Well, first of all, ask for recommendations from the wine professional at the restaurant. Most likely, they'll be able to lead you on to something that you may not have had before. But there's also some words that you're going to need to use to get your point across to the wine professional, because some of the words that we use are a little bit different. Now, some of the words like sweet obviously has the same connotations because you're talking about something that has residual sugar, something that actually does taste sweet. And here's a little hint on finding out if a wine is sweet or not. Take the tip of your tongue and just tip it right into the little top of the wine itself, and that's going to indicate whether or not there's sugar in the wine. Dry is exactly the opposite of sweet. Now, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion because a lot of people will confuse a dry red wine with the tannins that's in the wine itself. The tannins are the things that actually make your mouth dry up. That's kind of like eating an aspirin. It's kind of bitter. That's what we use when we say a wine is tannic. We don't say that wine is dry. Although it is dry, there's very little residual sugar in it. But when most people say they don't like red wines because they're too dry, most people are thinking about the fact that dry red wines have a lot of tannin to them. And it's uncomfortable, and it's not something they want to just kind of sip along. So the word dry means a couple different things. But basically, for us, when we're talking about wines, it basically means that the wine has no residual sugar. Crisp is another word that we use an awful lot. Crisp like a Sauvignon Blanc or a Pinot Grigio, that's the acid in the wine that actually makes your mouth begin to water. And we utilize that a lot in aperitifs, wines in the beginning of a meal, to help you salivate, to get your appetite going. Crisp wines are also known as acidic. They're also known as bright, lively, fresh. All of these words basically mean the same thing. Those are crisp wines with high levels of acidity. Now, you can also have high levels of acidity and sweetness, as in some German wines, and that's a really good balance because the sweetness is balanced out with the acidity. Neither one of them overpowers the other one, and it's an excellent, excellent wine for everybody. A couple of other words that we like to use are fruity. Now, a fruity wine is something that actually you can smell the fruit. You're tasting the fruit, and it may be reminiscent of blueberries or blackberries or black cherries or bananas. But this fruitiness is something that you actually can smell as opposed to sweetness, which you actually can taste. So you can have a very, very fruity wine and yet be very, very dry. Often an Alsatian wine, like an Alsatian Pinot Blanc, an Alsatian Gewürztraminer, these wines have been fermented to the point where there's no residual sugar left over, but they still have fruitiness in them. So as you're actually smelling and tasting the wine, you're getting a kind of a conflict here, because you're smelling fruit, but you're not tasting it being sweet, because that's what we always have had, as some very nice sweet, fruity German-style wines. But when you're tasting the Alsatian wines with that dryness, it really is a bit of a conundrum, and it's a little bit different. Those are very, very good food wines, but again, high acid with fruitiness, but not necessarily sweet. Also, when you're talking about trying to choose a wine for a group of people, you're going to want to know whether or not that wine's actually mature or whether that wine's fairly young. Now, a mature red wine is not seen a lot in wines in the United States. We tend to drink our wines much too young. We usually buy them, throw them in the wine rack, and 2 days later they're consumed. Restaurants, in some cases, have an opportunity to actually cellar red wines and actually allow those red wines to mature. What happens when a red wine begins to mature is those tannins we talked about a little bit earlier, they begin to mellow. They soften out, and everything becomes much more integrated into the wine. So when you're actually tasting the wine, the fruit's not nearly as forward as it was when the wine was young. The tannins are a lot less biting. They're much more mellow. Everything meshes, everything melds, and the wine, in the case of certain first growths out of Bordeaux or some really good Italian wines, ages very well and puts all of those components together. On the other hand, white wines don't tend to age that well. We generally tend to drink our white wines much younger, as we should, because for the most part, the Gewürztraminer, the Chenin Blanc, the Riesling, the Semillon, the Sauvignon Blanc, all of these grape varietals don't tend to make wines that are well adapted for aging. Chardonnay, on the other hand, as in some white Burgundies, can be aged for an extended period of time, but you have to be very, very careful on how you're aging it, what type of environment you're aging it, and for how long. Also, it's going to be very important in what type of vintage it is. Is the vintage very good for that particular wine? There are certain vintages that are much more well adapted for aging than other vintages. And again, in white wines, we're also looking for a little bit of acid to continue on and help that aging process, so all of those components come together and produce a very well integrated wine. Well, that's it on trying to choose a wine. And just remember, don't ever drink a wine just because somebody else says you should.